A pretty minor mechanic in the game is altering garments. Most of the players might only know about the alteration with removing the capes or having an alternative look, but there is more to this. Oddly enough, altering armor in Elden Ring triggers mechanical and narrative shifts that are easily overlooked. Immediately after altering the armor set, we see the change in stats. I mean, it makes sense that changing or stripping away heavy fabric or metal plating understandably lowers a garment's defensive resistances, but that is not the only change. In some cases, the item weight is also lowered, so if you still want to wear an armor set while fat rolling, altering the garment is a clever choice, as you can still wear the armor and at the same time you have the ability to mid-roll. The alteration process can also actively add or remove hidden passive abilities. For example, modifying the duelist cloak to its altered state physically reveals the reviled symbol of a snake. This actively draws enemy aggression toward the wearer, functioning exactly like the Shabriri's Woe talisman. Conversely, altering the Black Knife armor removes its translucent cape, which completely strips away the chest piece's unique strength-enhancing properties. Finally, modifying armor often reveals entirely new pieces of lore. The altered items frequently feature different item descriptions and expand upon the game's history. The altered Land of Reeds armor provides specific details about the distant region's brutal civil war. Similarly, removing the cape from Loretta's Royal Knight armor strips away the Carian royal colors, and the text actually changes to detail her journey after she abandoned her position as a Carian knight. This system ensures that even the simple act of tailoring clothes is tied directly to discovering the world's hidden narrative. Mad Tongue Alberich is one of the first NPC invaders players encounter, ambushing anyone who jumps over the balcony inside the Round Table hold. However, defeating him in this early encounter does not reward you with his gear. He only drops the Taunter's Tongue. To actually get Alberich's set, you have to wait until you reach Leyndell, royal capital. You must navigate to the fortified manor, which serves as the physical real-world equivalent of Round Table hold. If you walk into the exact ground floor room where Alberich invaded you in the hub world, you will find his complete armor set resting on a corpse. The armor set features a distinct headpiece officially named Alberich's Pointed Hat, recognizable by its wide brim, red glintstones, and a massive conical point. Using the tailored tool at the site of grace allows you to alter this item. Altering the headpiece completely removes the large witch-like cone, and the headgear now looks more like a headband. However, the developers neglected to adjust the item's text to match its new physical model. The modified item is strictly labeled as Alberich's Pointed Hat Altered. By removing the point, the garment completely ceases to be a pointed hat. Naming the base item simply Alberich's Hat would have prevented the contradiction, but instead, the final game leaves players equipping a pointed hat that lacks a point. If you heavily use magic or consumables, you will quickly notice a frustrating habit among the humanoid enemies in the lands between. NPC invaders, crucible knights, and agile bosses frequently dodge throwing daggers and standard glintstone sorceries with perfect precision. This happens because the enemy's artificial intelligence is reading your button inputs, physically sidestepping the exact moment you cast a spell rather than waiting for the projectile to travel toward them. However, there is one specific category of magic that entirely bypasses this behavior: night sorceries. When you cast spells like Night Comet or Night Shard, humanoid enemies will not attempt to evade. They simply continue walking forward and absorb the damage. While this might look like a flaw in the enemy's behavior code, it might actually be a deliberate mechanic dedicated to the game's written lore. The night in the names of these sorceries might be a metaphor representing the literal invisibility of these magical spells. Item descriptions for these specific spells reveal that they were originally developed by assassins of Celia, specifically designed to hide glintstone magic within darkness to ensure a fatal strike. Because these projectiles are canonically unseen by the naked eye, the developers explicitly disabled the enemy's ability to input read via casting animations. The enemies do not dodge the spells because, from their perspective within the game world, there is absolutely nothing there to dodge. The abductor versions are a little odd too. They feature one of the most punishing grab attacks in the game. When the metallic doors on their torsos swing open to pull the player inside, the chaotic nature of the combat animation leads most players to assume they are being grabbed by a pair of pale mechanical arms or elongated hands. However, closely examining the internal character model reveals a much more unsettling truth. The appendages hiding inside the Iron Maiden are actually a cluster of living snakes. This detail firmly grounds the machines in the lore of their creator, Praetor Rykard. The Volcano Manor faction is entirely defined by its heretical worship of the god-devouring serpent. By housing living snakes within the interior of these Iron Maidens, the abductor version shows Rykard's obsession with snakes. The Shadow of the Erdtree expansion introduces a new environmental obstacle, sealed spirit springs. To unlock these, the game intends for you to search the surrounding cliffs and caves to break these hidden piles of glowing stones. However, you can completely bypass this exploration requirement by exploiting the hidden mechanics of base game items. Both Margit's and Mog's Shackle project a colossal invisible area of effect hitbox when activated. While originally programmed to pin down specific bosses, this zero damage shockwave interacts with destructible environmental triggers. If you stand near a locked spirit spring and use either Shackle, the invisible shockwave expands outward and instantly shatters the corresponding stone pile, regardless of where it is hidden in the immediate area. This interaction allows you to unlock the springs immediately without needing to actively search for the pile of rocks. Alright, this is a pretty amazing mechanic. Most spirit ashes charge straight into a fight, but Latenna, the Alberich, literally doesn't have working legs. Thanks to the tragic law of the first generation Alberichs, she is paralyzed from the waist down. If you summon her in a normal boss room, she just plops onto the floor and acts like a sniper turret. But she actually has a brilliant backup plan. If you happen to summon her right next to a wild hostile direwolf like the ones hanging around Carrier Manor or the consecrated snowfield, instead of getting eaten, she instantly tames the angry wolf, hops on its back, and starts riding it around the battlefield. Placisdusax is easily one of the most cinematic boss encounters in the game, but there is a brilliant detail hiding in plain sight just outside the arena of Malekith. In case you missed the lore, you do not actually fight this boss in the present day. When you lie down at the bottom of the floating ruins, the surrounding storm literally rewinds time, pulling you back to a prehistoric era where he was still an active Elden Lord. But this raises an obvious question. If you travel back in time to kill him, where is his actual body in the present timeline? It turns out, From Software actually put it on display. If you head to the beside the Great Bridge site of Grace, which is the final checkpoint right before Malekith, and walk over to the cliffs on the right, look out toward the distant rock. It is a pretty hard thing to spot with the naked eye, but if you pull out a telescope or use a bow to zoom in, you can clearly see a colossal dragon corpse physically embedded into the stone. The anatomy, from the distinct head shape to the decayed coloring, perfectly matches Placidusax. You can clearly see his two heads poking out of the rocks. His tail and wings are also clearly visible. I never noticed this detail until the making of this video, so it was odd to me. From Software never ceases to surprise me with details, even till this day. If Igon's whole unhinged obsession with a giant monster felt a little familiar, it's because the guy is basically a massive reference to Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. Just like Ahab losing a leg to a white whale becomes his entire personality, Igon is a hunter who is completely consumed by a self-destructive hatred for Baal the Dread. The parallels are everywhere once you actually look at him. His legs are completely shattered, forcing him to drag himself across the dirt. But he does not let a little thing like total physical disability stop him from beefing with a dragon. The reference gets even more literal when you look at his weaponry. Most dragon hunters in Elden Ring use traditional katanas or lightning spells, but Igon uses harpoons. Specifically, he uses Igon's greatbow to fire massive harpoons that are designed to pin a monster down. In the world of Moby Dick, Ahab's weapon of choice was the harpoon, and the imagery of Igon, who is depicted as a broken man desperately trying to harpoon a flying mountain of a dragon, is a direct nod to the story of the white whale. Even his great harpoon item description hints at this obsession, hence making it clear. Did you know that Messmer the Impaler is functionally blind? Kinda odd for someone who throws his spear so accurately. If you actually zoom in onto his character model, one of his eyes is just permanently shut. The other one is completely sealed by an iris of grace, which basically is a blinding lock placed there by his mother Marika to hide the abyssal serpents lurking inside him. This raises a massive question. How exactly does a guy with 0 working eyes track your movements with such surgical mid-air precision? The answer is that Messmer is literally seeing through his snakes. Those winged serpents draped over his shoulders are his source of vision. Throughout the first phase of the fight, they act as his natural eyes, constantly shifting and scanning the arena to feed him visual information so he can perfectly skewer you. When you finally reach the mountaintops of the giants, the area feels absolutely massive. The first thing is that you take another life from the Atlas Plateau to even reach that area. This gives the illusion that the mountaintops are huge. Also, looking at just the mountaintops portion of the map, it's more than evident that the area is pretty massive. But it turns out the whole thing is basically a clever trick. If you map out only the explorable terrain and cut out all the dead space, the region is surprisingly tiny. When you take that actual playable area and lay it over Caelid, the mountaintops is actually the smaller zone. The moment you step foot into the gravesite plane, you quickly realize that your level 150 character, who was basically a god walking through the base game, is suddenly getting two-shotted by a random curse blade doing gymnastics. This naturally leads to the most controversial mechanic in the expansion, Shadow Tree fragments. People were understandably frustrated, wondering why their overleveled builds were suddenly completely useless. The technical answer is that the Land of Shadow slaps a massive invisible negation multiplier onto your character the second you load in. Without those fragments, you are fighting under a heavy debuff. At Blessing level 0, you take the full brunt of the enemy's attacks. By the time you hit the maximum level of 20, you are dealing roughly double your normal damage, and taking about half as much in return. But there is a catch. Following a post-launch patch to address the initial player outrage, the developers adjusted this power, scaling to follow a steep logarithmic curve. The first 12 blessing levels hand out massive power spikes to help you survive the early zones. However, once you hit that soft cap, levels 13 through 20, offer seriously diminishing returns. They made the system specifically to kill stat checking. They wanted early bosses, like the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, to demand actual effort. But they also needed to ensure you didn't become completely invincible by the time you reach the final boss. It is a highly effective, if slightly punishing, way to reset the playing field. It guarantees that no matter how many millions of runes you farm back at Morgwyn Palace, you still have to earn your right to survive the expansion by actually exploring the map. Did you know that the massive waking mausoleums actually have a sleep schedule? If you hang around until late night in the game world, which takes exactly 22.5 minutes of real time after the night cycle starts, these giant bell-ringing stone structures will literally just fall asleep and stop moving entirely. But if you are trying to bring one down, you absolutely do not need to stand around waiting. Instead of setting the time to night and waiting around, you just rest at a site of grace and pass the time to morning. For whatever reason, this completely breaks the mausoleum's internal clock, triggering the sleep state immediately so you can walk right up to the stationary target. It was always that simple. It is exactly the kind of obscure, unnecessary mechanic From Software loves to code in, just for the fun of it. But here is the real kicker. This morning skip works on every single mausoleum in the game, with exactly one exception. The artillery firing mausoleum in the consecrated snowfield does not sleep at all, which leaves us with a massive unanswered lore question. What exactly is keeping that specific mausoleum awake? And why is it so incredibly angry? Well, that is up to you guys to figure out. If you finally manage to survive Waterfowl Dance and actually defeat the Blade of Miquella, you are rewarded with her signature weapon, the Hand of Malenia. But if you read the stats on this legendary katana, there is a bizarre mechanical inconsistency staring right back at you. It has passive bleed buildup. Think back to the hundreds of times she killed you in that arena. She slices you to pieces, she inflicts massive amounts of scarlet rot in her second phase, and she famously heals herself with every single strike. But not once does she actually trigger a hemorrhage effect on you. In Elden Ring, almost every single katana has innate blood loss baked into its weapon class. When From Software handed the sword over to the player, they just let it function like a standard high-tier katana. But for the actual encounter, the developers clearly knew exactly where to draw the line. Giving her a move that hits as many times as Waterfowl Dance, combining it with her aggressive lifesteal and then a passive ability to bleed proc on top of it, would have broken the fight completely. If you decide to ignore the main path and wander into the southeast corner of the Gravesite Plain, you will eventually stumble across the Church of Consolation. The entrance is actively guarded by a Black Knight, whose entire purpose is to gatekeep your first major power spike in the DLC. But the actual secret of this place is not the fight, but it is a hidden piece of environmental storytelling. Throughout the base game, the churches of Marika are pristine places of worship, always featuring an untouchable statue of the goddess in her iconic T-pose. But if you walk inside this church and actually look at the altar, Marika's head has been completely ripped off. This is a massive clue about the state of the Land of Shadow. Removing the head of a divine statue is the ultimate act of blasphemy against the Golden Order. It tells a very specific story, even though Messmer's army originally marched in Marika's name. The soldiers trapped in this realm eventually realized they were abandoned. There was a strong chance this vandalism was a direct order from Messmer himself. After Marika used him to execute a brutal crusade and then promptly sealed him away in the Shadow Realm to hide his serpent, he understandably grew to despise her. If you want to talk about absolute brain-melting oddities, we have to look closer at Estelle's actual character model, because the anatomy is deeply cursed. First, look at its face. Tucked right behind those massive stag beetle mandibles is a disturbingly realistic human skull. But the true obscure detail is inside the mouth. It does not have fangs or sharp predatory teeth. It just has a perfectly normal set of human teeth. And the internal game assets make it even weirder. During the fight, the skull violently cracks open to reveal a massive, swirling cosmic eye. But if you use external rendering tools to literally rip that eye out of the game model and look at it in a vacuum, it is not actually an eyeball. The 3D asset structurally looks just like a massive planet. Also, the life cycle of this Estelle is heavily inspired by a real-world insect called the antlion. In real life, an antlion larva digs a death pit in the dirt and waits at the bottom with massive jaws to trap prey. This perfectly mirrors the falling star beast, which is actually just Estelle's larval stage, sitting inside its impact craters. Once an antlion eats enough, it sheds its stubby body and grows into a spindly winged insect. If you want hard proof baked directly into the game engine, just look at a mature falling star beast. If you clip the camera through the thick fur right below its central eye, you can actually see Estelle's terrifying human-like skull already fully formed inside, just waiting to break out of the shell. This is one of the reasons General Radahn paused the stars. There is actually a massive piece of cut content proving this. Deep in the game's internal data, Estelle has a fully functioning unused animation where it crashes into the ground as a living meteor, using the exact same visual effects as Radahn's infamous orbital strike. The working theory among data miners is that the second you killed Radahn and freed the stars, an Estelle was originally programmed to instantly crash land onto the boss arena and fight you. If we spend enough time wandering the land between after nightfall, we inevitably run into one of the game's most terrifying field bosses, the Deathbirds. They have tattered, completely featherless wings, but when we check the item design on the sacrificial axe, it actually depicts a Deathbird with a full coat of feathers and lively features. Seems like they did not always look like this decaying mess. These creatures wield barbed pokers and act as the keepers of the ghost flame, a cold spectral fire created by burning the dead. Before the Erd Tree and its modern burial practices took over, this was the standard way to dispose of corpses. It was not exactly a peaceful rest, as the process actively spawned vengeful spirits. Yet, ancient priests willingly chose to undergo this process to serve as guardians in death. We can clearly see these ethereal bound souls trapped in the wings of the stronger deathrite birds, clasping their branched spears. But when we actually zoomed in and inspected the character models of the lesser deathbirds, we found a massive oddity. Right inside the open cavity of their torsos, there are entirely intact physical bodies, violently merged into the bird's flesh. They are the actual tangible corpses. This made us realize that the ancient death rite binding these followers to the birds does not necessarily require burning them down to ash. We actually see a completely parallel ritual with the Mausoleum Knights. Instead of burning themselves in the ghost flame, these knights willingly sever their own heads to match their dead demigod masters, permanently cursing their spirits so they can guard the wandering mausoleums. But if we look closely at the armor they wear, it is adorned with makeshift bird wings. Even in their self-inflicted curse, they are actively trying to tie themselves to the deathbirds. The lore behind all these grotesque rituals is that the deathbirds are directly linked to an unnamed outer god through their mother, the twin bird. Their entire system of death is fundamentally removed from the Erd Tree and operates entirely on its own rules. For the followers bound to these birds, they are promised an eventual resurrection. Let us talk about the mimic tier. If we dig into the cut content, Obtaining this summon was originally tied to a deeply unsettling question involving a silver tier named Asimi. Instead of just finding the ash, Asimi would literally beg for its life and trick us into letting it live inside our bodies like a parasite. It would occasionally speak to us in our heads as we traveled. The ultimate payoff for feeding it from sacred chalices in the Eternal Cities? It actively tries to hijack your existence. You would eventually have to control and fight your own sentient backstabbing clone because it decided it wanted to become the sovereign eternal instead of letting you become the Elden Lord. If you try to solve the converted Fringe Tower completely offline, the game does technically give you every piece of the answer, but it forces you to connect the dots scattered across the entire region of Liurnia. It starts with the riddle etched onto the door. May erudition light the way. To get the erudition gesture in the first place, you have to find an optional second glintstone key hidden on the rooftops of Raya Lucaria and hand it over to Thops, the Church of Erith. Once you finally walk into the tower, you are greeted by a statue actively doing the erudition pose right in front of you. You have to realize that erudition is strictly tied to the high scholars of the academy, dig through your inventory, and equip one of the stone glintstone crowns dropped by the sorcerers. Almost nobody connects all these dots organically on a blind solo run, and From Software knows that. The entire puzzle relies on the probability that, out of millions of players, one person would accidentally hit the emote while wearing a sorcerer mask, realize it worked, and leave a glowing message on the floor that reads, "Head required a head. Therefore, try gesture," or something like that. If you play Elden Ring completely offline, the NPC combatants in the game are fairly predictable. But if you play online, there are two specific encounters that are mechanically designed to make you suffer. Fierce champions in the Deep-Root's depths and the Knights of the Great Jar sitting in front of the Caelid Colosseum. Most players assume that these are just procedurally generated, standard From Software NPCs. But thanks to data miners, we know exactly how this system works. When you get hugged by fear, or when you successfully beat the Great Jar Challenge, the game silently takes a snapshot of your current character build and uploads it directly to the Elden Ring service. Those nameless champions you are fighting are not developer-made assets. They are the exact hyper-optimized builds of other real players. This explains why the Great Jar Trial in particular feels so brutally unbalanced. You are fighting the ghosts of players who are actively exploiting the game's most broken meta builds. You might walk up to the jar expecting a fair duel, only to instantly get vaporized by a dual-wielding glass cannon wearing heavy armor and spamming DLC weapons. Every Elden Ring playthrough seems to share the exact same origin story. You walk out of the tutorial, avoid the tree sentinel, and follow the glowing road directly to the Great Front ruins. You sit at the site of grace, and Malenia materializes out of thin air to offer you an accord and your spectral steed. Because this sequence feels so perfectly choreographed, almost every player assumed her introduction was permanently hard-coded to this specific camp. But this is a complete illusion. The game does not actually care about your location or the sequence you hit the grace. The trigger for Malenia's cinematic is just resting at any 3 overworld sites of grace in Limgrave. If you completely ignore the intended path, run in the opposite direction, and rest at the seaside ruins or the Third Church of Marika, she will still appear exactly on cue the moment you sit down for the 3rd time. The Gatefront Ruins encounter is not a mandatory story trigger. The only reason why people say that it's the trigger point for Malenia is because literally everyone takes that path and then triggers Malenia. The moment you step out into the gravesite plain, The game immediately tries to intimidate you with a massive burning golem aimlessly pacing the horizon. The visual design is a homage to the 1973 horror film The Wicker Man, where a giant wooden effigy is used to burn a living sacrifice. Only here, Messmer mass-produced them. They are literally mobile cremation chambers built specifically to incinerate the horn scent during his crusade. If you look closely at the open basket on top of the golem's head, you can see it is completely overflowing with hundreds of burning corpses. There is even a corpse of a dragon inside it. At the absolute peak of the Belly Rat Tower settlement sits the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, which is arguably the most bizarre boss encounter in the entire expansion. To understand what you are actually looking at, you have to understand the horn scent. In their culture, horns are a direct blessing from the Crucible. The most revered figures in this society are the divine beasts, which act as messengers from the heavens. When you finally step into the theater of Bellyrat, the game uses swirling storm clouds and frantic camera angles to convince you that you are fighting one of these apex predators. But if you strip away the visual noise, you realize you are essentially fighting two guys in a suit. The dancing lion is a ritualistic puppet directly mirroring real-world lion dances. The boss is quite literally just two horn-scent ascetics operating a costume in complete tandem. If you stop panic rolling long enough to watch the actual character model, you can clearly see the lead dancer manually operating the massive head, physically snapping the wooden jaws shut during lunge attacks. Meanwhile, the second dancer is tucked entirely into the back half, acting as a structural support and a physical platform for the lead when the lion rears up into the air. Through their synchronized movements, they are actively channeling the soul of a true divine beast. Throughout your entire journey, Enia the finger reader constantly translates the movement of the two fingers, convincing you that the greater will is actively guiding your path. But there is a glaring oddity that completely dismantles this narrative. Every time you climb onto the peak of a divine tower to activate a defeated demigod's great rune, you find a pair of two fingers seated in the center of the arena. However, every single one of them is completely petrified and dead. The environmental evidence strongly suggests the communication lines to the outer gods were severed ages ago. The entity pulling the strings in the Round Table hold is running on delayed centuries-old instructions. When you take the massive elevator down into the Siofra River for the first time, you are descending deep beneath the crust of Limgrave. Yet when you step out of the lift, you look up and see a sprawling starry night sky. The game never hands you an item description explicitly explaining this. The Nox civilization was banished underground for an ancient treason against the Greater Will, completely cut off from the real sky and the stars that powered their specific branch of glintstone sorcery. So they simply built a fake one. The stars you see in Siofra and Nokran are thousands of glowing magical deposits embedded into the cavern's ceiling. The Golden Order operates on the fundamental claim that Marika's lineage is perfect and eternal. The game explicitly tells you that Godwyn the Golden was the first demigod to ever die, but if you pay attention to the wandering mausoleums heavily patrolling the map, that official timeline completely falls apart. Inside every single one of them rests the corpse of a soulless demigod. If Godwyn was the first, there is no reason for over half a dozen dead demigods to exist. The environmental implications are grim. Marika and the Golden Order were quietly producing massive amounts of unwanted or politically inconvenient offspring long before the shattering ever happened. To hide this divine failure, they chopped off the children's heads, shoved their bodies into stone crypts, and put them on giant stone legs just to keep the evidence constantly moving away from the capital. There is a deeply punishing mechanic hidden inside the Divine Beast's Dancing Lion encounter. This actively breaks one of the most fundamental rules of the game's combat loop. Normally, a boss grab attack is just a massive damage check. You survive the animation, you stand back up, and immediately you drink a crimson flask to recover. If you rely on that exact muscle memory response during this fight, well, let me tell you, you are going to be betrayed. When the Dancing Lion successfully lands its biting grab attack, it leaves your character marked with a distinct red aura. This debuff creates a temporary debuff, which is, if you drink from your flask while the aura is active, a substantial portion of that restoration is transferred directly to the Divine Beast. It literally steals your healing, and the punishment actually scales with your progression. A fully upgraded flask will restore up more percentage of the boss's maximum health. For over a decade, From Software maintained a fairly consistent ceiling on just how large they were willing to scale a dragon model. Since Demon Souls, the absolute record holder was the Dragon God, measuring roughly 183 meters from nose to tail. It was a massive architectural hazard that defined the scale of that game. Elden Ring eventually shattered that record with Grandsax, dropping a petrified dragon 9 times the size of its standard ancient counterparts directly into the middle of the capital city. It seemed like the final word on a draconic scale. Then the expansion was released. If you ride to the foot of the jagged peak, you will find the Grand Altar of Dragon Communion. The altar itself is almost an afterthought because it is physically crushed beneath a nameless dead dragon. This creature is so unreasonably massive that the developers literally had to bake it into the 2D map as a geographical landmark. Because the model is slumped over and contoured, the sheer size is hard to process visually, but if you break down the actual game assets, the math is absurd. The corpse is essentially a scaled-up version of the standard jagged peak drakes roaming the area. By comparing their skull proportions, the community determined the Titan is roughly 10.7 times larger than its living relatives. When you scale the entire skeletal frame to match that multiplier, its total length stretches to almost 392 meters. It is over twice the size of the Dragon God and completely eclipses Grandsax. It is officially the largest draconic entity From Software has ever created. Stepping out of Castle Enzis to Shadow Altus is the most intentional atmospheric pivot in the entire game. It is designed as a direct mirror to the Altus Plateau. In the lands between, the Altus Plateau serves as the Golden Order's primary propaganda tool. It is saturated in literal gold, bathed in falling leaves, and framed as the divine seat of America. Shadow Altus is the complete opposite of that paradise. It is a landscape choked by ash, dominated by a bleeding, fractured tree that appears to be suffocating under its own canopy. The contrast is heavily embedded in the structural layout. In the base game, the focal point of the region is Leyndell. It is a sprawling, functional capital city built to house a population and facilitate worship. The geographical equivalent in Shadow Altus is the Shadow Keep, which serves a different purpose. The Shadow Keep is a militarized storage unit, while Leyndell houses the nobility. Messmer's fortress operates as a black site warehouse for everything American needed to physically bury. It is a massive archive of political sins, hoarding pickled remains, jarred shamans, and anomalies that completely contradict the Golden Order's pristine narrative. Even the basic enemy patrol route reflects this shift in purpose. The roads of the Altus Plateau are guarded by tree sentinels, knights in heavy golden armor on horseback, projecting an image of divine security. In contrast, the main roads of Shadow Altus are patrolled by furnace golems. They do not project security, but they rather project genocide. This mirroring extends all the way down to the local botany. The base game uses golden sunflowers that stand upright, eagerly tracking the light of the Earth Tree. The Shadow Realm replaces them with shadow sunflowers. Their physical models are withered, drained of color, and permanently bowed toward the Shadow Tree. They have completely given up on the light. As you push toward the summit of Jagged Peak, you'll run into what many players consider one of the most frustrating bosses in the expansion: Ancient Dragon Cinder. At first glance, this fight feels like a bit of a copy-paste job, using the same movesets as the ancient dragons from the base game. To make matters worse, she's stationed in a massive pool of water, which makes her red lightning attacks more powerful and almost covers the entire area. But there is a fascinating lore reason as to why this specific ancient dragon is hanging out in the heart of a territory ruled by her rivals. Throughout the DLC, we're told that Bale the Dread is a traitor who fought the Dragonlord Placidusax, and that his drakes are lesser mutated versions of the true ancient dragons. So why is a true four-winged dragon like Cinder guarding the path for him? The answer is hidden in the item description of the hefty red lightning pot. The description reveals a dark truth. The ancient dragons who betrayed their lord to side with a tyrant were known for wielding branching red lightning. This confirms that Cinder was a turncoat. She betrayed her own kind and her lord Placidusax to side with the tyrant Bale. This kind of makes way for why there is a recycled boss fight here. I mean, don't get me wrong, this lore reason does not just justify the reason that the boss is still terrible. But yeah, both Rykard and Messmer are demigods permanently fused with massive serpents. The mechanical and narrative aspects they share with their respective serpents are completely different. Rykard's relationship with the god-devouring serpent is voluntary and is based on gluttony. Rykard actively sought out the ancient serpent of Mount Gelmer and willfully fed himself to it. The god-devouring serpent is a physical creature that grows by consuming champions and grafting their biomass on its own. Rykard operated from the inside out, proudly speaking through a face stretched across its throat. They share a unified conscious goal: to physically devour the very gods. In contrast, Messmer's relationship with the Abyssal Serpent is more like a hostage situation. Messmer was born infected with a curse. The Abyssal Serpent is an entity of dark, lightless flame that lives entirely within his own body, constantly eating away at his inner fire. Messmer absolutely despises it. His mother, Marika, had to physically pluck out his eye and replace it with a golden seal of grace just to suppress the snake's influence and lock it away. When Rykard fights, he actively uses the massive bulk of his serpent to crush you. When Messmer fights, he relies strictly on his own martial prowess and fire, keeping the base serpent locked away with the help of his winged serpents. It is only when Messmer is pushed to the absolute brink of death that he physically crushes his mother's seal. He does it because he would rather let the base serpent consume his body rather than fail his crusade. These are just some of the many oddities hidden throughout Elden Ring. While it may appear to be a rather light-hearted game at first glance, beneath its beautiful world lies a collection of some of the most unsettling creatures From Software has ever created. So, let's journey deep into the lands between as we uncover and investigate its most horrifying monsters.